Hey everyone, this is Tyler. Many of you know me, hopefully some AET folks in here. For those who don't, I am an adjunct lecturer at the University of Texas in the Arts and Entertainment Technology. Teach game design, game modding, programming, all sorts of fun stuff there. I'm also an indie dev by trade. I make a couple games, merchant, etc., and so forth. And I have with me here Brian. Brian is one part of Freehold Games. Previously developed the game Sproggywood. Currently also developing the game Caves of Cud. Has been for a good bit of time, probably a little while longer. Brian, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I'm Brian Bucklew. Like Tyler said, I'm one of the co-founders of Freehold Games, indie game studio. We do Sproggywood, Caves of Cud. Our first commercial release was Sproggywood in 2014. We've been working on Caves of Cud for, in various forms for 15, 20 years almost. Been quite a while. Been a bit of a journey. And I've come from a non-games background. I still work a non-games full-time job. And so indie games is sort of a side gig for me in a lot of ways, but we're making it work best as we can.
Awesome. So I'm going to start us off with a question from one of the students. One comes from Joseph. So thank you, Joseph. Do you design your games and mechanics based off of what is fun for you to make or play? Or is it based on what you think people playing your games will enjoy? So is it intrinsic, extrinsic? What's the development goal there?
I mean, our design process has sort of matured over time. I think Caves of Cud came directly out of a space where we were like, we like Game of World and ADOM and Dune, and when we're looking for a roguelike to play, other than maybe Alpha Man, there's no sci-fi roguelikes that exist. So how can we take these elements and make a game that's sort of purely for us? And ultimately that's been a very successful tack if scope uncontrolled. Sproggywood was a little bit more like, what if we made a mobile roguelike for people who weren't really directly us? We had a consumer in mind. I'm sort of a bit of a consumer of those kind of casual Kairosoft style games. They tend to be a little lightweight and a little free to play heavy for me nowadays. But again, this is mostly us as a customer in mind, with some adjacency. And I think that was a little less successful in Caves of Cud, trying to target an audience that really wasn't directly us. Though it's relatively well reviewed. It's certainly less useful than Caves of Cud.
Do you feel like you've found audiences you didn't expect?
Oh, I mean, for Caves of Cud, certainly. I mean, I think we launched Caves of Cud commercially on Steam in the lee of Sproggywood. We were able to skip Greenlight, which took a lot of the risk of launching Caves of Cud, and we said, well, we'll put it out there with tiles and we'll sell 800 copies or whatever and move on. And instead, the launch was multiples better than Sproggywood. There was people really interested in traditional roguelikes there, and we were surprised at the size of that audience. Right? It hasn't sold tens of millions of copies or anything, but it's sold hundreds of thousands of copies, which was way more than we would expect.
Yeah,
right, for that market to exist.
and it's definitely something that's been a slow process, right? I mean, it's not like it launched and sold all those copies. It's been
we're up into the realm of 100,000 copies over 5 years, right? And so you can see that, even though it sounds like quite a lot of sales and quite a lot of money, when you stretch it out over the team's various grown a bit from 2 to 6 to 12, depending on how you count people, mostly part-time. That many sales over 5 years is a pretty liminal financial space for a business to be in. We make it work, but it's it's successful in the margins with respect to business success.
So I should also mention the EGaDS group here, the student group, has had previous involvement, had mentors and help from Niantic. And some of the folks that were at EGaDS went on to actually work at Niantic. So I was wondering if I could just pick your brain a bit about you. You entered the Niantic competition. So you clearly have interests outside of roguelike space. Like,
Oh, my
Are
interests
there
are fairly varied. Again, like
Yeah.
most of my life has been in enterprise software space, which is outside of games entirely. And I've certainly got interest in a wide range of software. I was approached by a group of friends that I'd never really been able to set up anything to like any projects where we could work together, but we were all sort of enamored with each other's work and a friend of mine put together a group and said, "You're invited to work on this group of 6 in this Niantic project. So we're going to pitch it. There's like a 0% chance we're actually going to get in the top 10 and get to build anything. But let's sit together and really work for a week on a pitch." And we did. The pitch was pretty good, and Niantic picked it up. And so we were one of the pitch finalists selected by Niantic. We got a fairly modest amount of money to do a 4-month prototype build for the contest. And we didn't end up at winning the contest, but we built a pretty cool little IP sort of centered around new spheric kaijus, which is sort of like way outside of Niantic's domain, which ultimately I think is why we weren't picked, right? Like they picked very family friendly games, and ours was,
Sure.
a very strange kind of concept.
Do you feel like experiences like that bleed in at all to your development for CUD?
Oh
Like
yeah, of course. I mean, I think games more than any other trade almost is really polydenominational, right? It's not about 3D graphics or 2D graphics or sound or audio. It's like all of those things plus writing plus playmaking plus non-games domain informing the story. Ultimately games I think is a very nascent kind of field, and I think we're still circling the entry point of sort of like early truly gamey games, arcade games, right? Like purely entertainment formats. And I think there's a lot of interactive experiences possible that nobody's tried yet at all, right? I mean, there's a lot to do outside of Pac-Man.
Yeah. We haven't had our Citizen Kane.
Yeah, sure. I think it'll be 800 years before we do, probably,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
this is a format that is just explosively
No one will
growing. It's
know what
really
Citizen
interesting.
Kane is by then.
No, you'll look at games 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. I mean, their character changes dramatically, right?
Sure.
And the tools that you're able to use to make them have changed dramatically, right? Like there was a real sea change in around 2007, like the iPhone came out, Unity came out. The iPhone came out with the App Store, which is like a very, it's got a lot of problems, but ultimately it's a very open platform for distributing games compared to the things that came before,
Yeah, the
right?
J2ME environment before that was
Yeah.
very wall gardened for sure.
Yep, yep. You had spaces like the Flash game ecosystem that weren't walled garden like that, and they were, in their own time, they served as really interesting experimental grounds for game making. So it's not unique, but I think with respect to like commercial AA, AAA feeling games, it became a new world in 2007, 2008.
Sure. Yeah, and it's interesting to see the sort of ebbs and flows of that because in the same realm, I think in the past 2 or 3 years, we've seen the entryway of VR and AR as to a more accepted form, especially for indies that are willing to experiment in the
Yeah.
way that Flash and mobile offered for indies a decade ago.
Yeah, I think VR and AR is really interesting. I think the technology is still, no matter how the marketing goes, I think the technology is still ultimately in its sort of Palm Pilot phase, right? Like you can see that it might be very interesting, but the cost, the form factor is still too heavy for most people to really enjoy. It's like very expensive. You're still really tethered, except for some experimental systems. But it's moving fast, and I don't think anybody really knows what's going to be interesting. I know I was surprised when the most interesting thing about VR systems weren't the headsets, but were rather the in-world controls.
Mm,
That is to say, like the hand controls, right, which
yeah,
gave you like really perfect, millimeter accurate movement. Those felt like the really groundbreaking thing when you opened up the Vive, right?
yeah,
Never really experienced anything like that. And really
yeah.
projected you into this virtual space. And I think we've got, over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, we're going to have a lot of the same advances with respect to integrating VR with AR with form factors that are smaller, and make it easier to integrate the real world and the virtual world. And I think the full play virtual experiences will probably take a backseat to melded reality kind of experiences. The reason why we're in pure virtual world is that that's what the technology can support. Right.
Sure. We actually have a question coming in from the chat. What do you think of hybrid systems like using the leap motion with VR headsets?
Well, like I said, I think that the world of input is the most interesting thing, right? The way that VR interacts with the real world is interesting. Right now, we're really tied and tethered to physical locations because of the limitations of VR headsets. They're very big. You tend to need to be tethered. Batteries are low. You can't really go outside with them. All of these things that make it difficult for AR to really play with the virtual world. But it's very clear that the long-term direction is, imagine eyeglasses, light AR headsets that allow you to really integrate in real time with the world. In 15 years, that's what people are really shooting for. And I think the affordances that work in that space are completely unknown, right? Like nobody knows what the input affordances really work in VR. Beat Saber was like, oh, you can chop these things with a lightsaber, and holy cow, that's like a whole new world of interactive affordances. But what other things are possible? Most experiments don't really work. You get in VR and it's like kind of fun, but you don't really want to do that for more than 2 hours. It was an interesting experiment. What are the ones that are really going to be catchy? What's like the mouse click of 2040? Nobody knows yet.
There's a good follow-up question here from Joshua. So thank you, Joshua. So this one kind of dives into a topic that we're definitely going to want to get into, which is ProcGen, but it actually relates to current topic is what made you decide to start learning procedural generation? And where do you see ProcGen being strongest in the future? And then the follow-up to that is any thoughts on ProcGen in VR development? So
Okay.
we can spread this out, but
so how did I get started? Yeah, let's start at the beginning here. How did I get interested in ProcGen? I was writing articles for roguelike news in like 1998 about dungeon generation. So I've been doing ProcGen for a very long time. The real roots of it are in some of the earliest games I played. I played Rogue on an old 8086 in the hills of West Virginia in the summers when I played, and it was like the only computer around, and it played mostly old games. And early on, I was enamored with games like Elite and Rogue and said, this is cool. This is something I want to be able to do. And my interest in roguelikes had me working on roguelikes very early. Roguelikes are a very deceptive space where you look at these kind of games and you say, oh yeah, this is easy. I can draw some text and no problem. This is
a kind of game I can make. 7 days.
Yeah, sure. You jump in that pool and it's 30 fathoms deep, and you very quickly learn that there's complexities there underneath the surface. Yeah. But they're seductive ones, right? They're really interesting ones, and that's a reason why a lot of people have sort of been pulled into the whirlpool of roguelike development.
70 RL feels like cutting an ice fishing hole and diving in thinking it's just a little puddle.
That's right.
Yep.
That's exactly right. Right. So, I think roguelikes early on were probably the key impetus to procedurality being interesting to me. The second part of that question was
where do you see ProcGen being strongest in the future?
Okay, so boy, ProcGen's a really tricky thing. You say, well, ProcGen versus handcrafted content, but the reality is that all ProcGen is handcrafted. You're crafting sort of a volume of space that your players can experience instead of one through line. But
even a lot of stuff we consider handcrafted has ProcGen elements in the process.
So, sure, absolutely. Yeah. Like the ultimately the creative process looks the same in ProcGen versus handcrafted lines. In early games, in fact, if you play a lot of like Atari 2600 games or other games, their underlying systems are ProcGen, but they just pick some seeds, and so you're playing one instance of a ProcGen system that they've curated. And I think ultimately, I think whether or not you have a computer system involved creativity is a lot about creating a volume of space around the ideas you want to communicate, and then curating good ideas out of that space, right? And so whether you expose the player to the more full volume of those possibilities, right? Like you got a bunch of circles and you say, well, you can explore any of these 12, or you curate just one of those ideas out and really develop it into a handcrafted point and click adventure. I think ultimately the idea of an expansive creative space and then curating and path through it is a key one, will continue to be a key one. And I think ProcGen in general is a really useful tool for sort of creative collaboration with the machine. It's really nice to have a system be able to work with you on its own creation. And I think ProcGen systems that are most interesting to me, and the use of systems like GPT-2, GPT-3, GPT-8, or whatever, in 5 or 10 years, that I think the use of those systems is sort of creative muses, where you use systems to sort of get around the structural walls that are sort of built into the human brain.
Get you past that blank page.
Yeah, exactly. Like, just give me 60 ideas in this space, with these constraints, and pick one of them that looks really interesting and elaborate on it. I think the relationship with procedural systems, with respect to artists and machines sort of communicating, using them as sort of creative oracles, is probably the most interesting aspect of procedurology to me. After making Caves of Cud and working with designers and writers building procedural systems, I'm actually a little more convinced that like just handcrafted narrative is often the right way to go. And I think that people, especially engineering people, tend to build procedural systems to avoid making content, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately you have to make content anyway, right? Like you end up at, well, I've got these billion systems, but I still have to build content for them.
Yeah.
Right. It's just sort of a way to procrastinate doing the hard work of creative and artistic creation ultimately.
I think it's interesting that like you really do need someone who's a subject matter expert in any content type you're generating procedurally. You can't just have the technician. Like having someone who really has a strong grasp of level design is still needed. You can't completely go in blind without having at least an understanding of the thing that you're generating.
Almost all really good procedural generation, in my experience, especially now that we're skilled in the craft, starts with a designer, an artist, a writer creating 20, 30, 100 handcrafted examples of the elements that you want the procedural system to generate. And then looking at those and picking them apart, right? Like taking tweezers and saying, what structures to these handcrafted examples share, right? Which elements of these can we pop out into procedural volume, right? Like what elements are amenable to variation over plays?
Where can the Mad Libs occur?
Yeah, sort of like having them put their creative spirit on the paper, and then picking that creative spirit apart and reverse engineering what their results were, and then baking that into a technical system that can reproduce sort of results in the same vein.
Absolutely.
And the same thing is true of GPT-3, right? Like, what is that? That's trained on 100 gajillion handwritten pieces of text, right?
Mostly Reddit, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, exactly. And you feed that into a system, and a adversarial neural network picks those apart, infers the structure, and then is able to reproduce the results, sort of baking the creative spirit of all those comments into a system. But that it starts with an artist just doing their human work.
Since we're on the topic of particular systems, I'd love to further pick your brain about the wave function collapse. So for those who haven't seen it, Brian gave a talk last year at the Roguelike Celebration. I just posted a link in the Twitch chat. I'd highly recommend checking out. So Brian's been working with WFC to do some really interesting generative things. The kind of a continuation, what have you learned since you gave that talk last year? Have you found any fun quirks or ways to better utilize it?
We haven't elaborated on WFC. The system that we built for Caves of Cud sort of meets our needs. Our main work on WFC is around performance tuning now, right? Like picking where between uses a ton of CPU and uses a bunch of memory, right? Which of those choices is going to be right for desktop, which of those is going to be right for mobile, because those requirements are a little different. The practice of WFC in Caves of Cud is still essentially what's baked into that talk.
There's actually a follow-up question in the Twitch chat is, do you think that using random noise for ProcGen will be less common as WFC becomes more popular?
I don't think so. I think WFC serves a need, which is to produce highly structured self-similar output in sort of tiled and texture generation space. Noise serves its own tool, which is to generate variation across large spatial domains, right? Which WFC like explicitly doesn't do well. If you read my talk, one of the things you work around with WFC is that outside, like if you give it an 8x8 input, it's going to be self-similar across the rough scale of 8x8 tiles, right? Each of those 8x8 tiles will be a little different. You'll have variation, but ultimately you'll have sort of like this homogeneity out at the resolution of your input texture. And the upside of noise is that it is not homogeneous. It smoothly varies, but an area here and an area here, which is 400 units away, can very explicitly be quite different, right? Like the upside of noise is that it varies very smoothly from point to point.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, a lot of times we'll use underlying noise to feed WFC output. So you imagine a simple map where here it's very low and here it's very high. And here at the low point, we're generating forests. And here at the high point, we're generating WFC ruins, right? And so across this noise map, you get a few ruins scattered around more general forests would be just a random example. And so I think there's a lot of tools like that are useful, and I don't think replace one another, but rather you sort of stack them on top of one
One
another
more
to
tool for the
produce.
belt.
Yeah, any individual tool, just WFC becomes very samey over space, right? Just noise has no real points of local interest, right? And so you want to combine these techniques and try to emphasize each of their strengths and minimize their weaknesses for whatever your particular project is.
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the interesting things for me with WFC is it's more immediately grokkable how you can use it for going beyond a one-dimensional value.
Mm-hmm.
So with Perlin or with just random any sorts of noise, it reads very clearly as this is a 0 to 255 or 0 to 1 range, and that's what I'm working with on a 2D space, on a 2D plane. But WFC having that input image or those input values, I think even though you can use Perlin noise for that, it is so much more immediately understandable how you could use WFC for it in just the image samples and like the examples given. And I think it's one of those situations where you can probably get similar outputs with the right tweaking and tuning of doing thresholded Perlin. You probably get a lot of very similar outputs to like a WFC system, but it's going to be easier to understand the process to get there with WFC because of that initial starting point.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to me they're just different tools, right? It's like, is the hammer going to replace the screwdriver? No, not really. If you're going to build something, you need both of them, right? Like any kind of complicated system, you want to use the right tool for, for the right result. And I think it's really good to have WFC, which is a new procedural generation system. There's lots of them, right? Like Dijkstra maps, Forione spaces, binary space partitioning. I mean, you can go on and on, right? Like I can dig up a list, or like I wrote a big technical chapter in the procedural generation book from Tanya and Tarn that goes all over a bunch of individual tools. But most of the maps in Caves of Cud are a layering of a bunch of techniques and not the result of choosing WFC over noise. They each do like a fairly different thing.
It's also, I would say, quite famously for a roguelike, very handcrafted, right? I mean, the CUD world is far more handcrafted than one expects from a roguelike environment, with the procedural layers, of course. And I'm sure procedural systems to originally create that kind of world and to create that space So I'd love to hear your thoughts on why handcraft this, why procedural that. Like where did you divine the choices in each context?
Sure. One thing we've grown to appreciate is the value of an existing static context to sort of imbue meaning for the procedural systems, which aren't complex enough yet to sort of define their own meaning on their own. Maybe in 30 years they are. Maybe you can feed them sort of abstracts and they can come up with some, real meaning and produce a representation of that. But right now, you're sort of limited to playing very advanced Mad Libs with input that you give it. And so you have to curate that input to create meaningful output, right? So that's step one. But aligning that with a set of static bones, which provides real sort of human crafted meaning. And that may be, for example, the handcrafted, handwritten world of Caves of Cud, which, Jason does like a truly profoundly good job in. It's like unique in the space of games in particular, which tends to not have good writing, to have like just really world-class literary writing as the bones for which the procedural generation can pull meaning from. But there's other ways to do that. For instance, I think there's a tendency for people to just create random sci-fi and fantasy worlds for games, right? Like I'm going to create a star exploration game or a solar system exploration game. It's going to randomly generate solar systems. But isn't it how if you were to, instead of randomly generate solar systems for a sci-fi game, instead base your game always in the Sol system with Earth and Jupiter and Mars, you inherit this huge amount of meaning for your procedural systems, right? It's a lot different than if like Zabodia 2 is destroyed by an alien invaders than if Mars is destroyed by alien invaders, right? The existing framework of meaning that we have for the solar system is imparted to your game, to your procedural systems, just by dint of saying Mars, right? Like you say Mars, there's a lot of meaning. You say London, there's a lot of meaning there, right?
Yeah.
And you sort of borrow that into your procedural variation.
You end up seeing that a lot, especially in sci-fi television, where they still end up having some base of operations on Earth, or something like The Expanse that's built fully in our solar system.
Yep.
You have those immediate context pointers.
Well, imagine The Expanse in a random sci-fi world.
It
Immediately less compelling, right?
It would
like
work, right? But
sure, I mean, you would watch it, but Earth and Mars at war is much more interesting just by dint of how much how much history, how much culture exists in your head when you say Earth and Mars than it would be if it was Alpha Centauri 2 and 3, right?
I think Dune is probably the best example of more or less throwing out any historical references to the dawn of man,
right?
Until I think like Dune 7 gets back into Earth or something. But
sure,
yeah, there's an interesting aspect there because Dune does feel far more foreign in the sense that it is so far flung future. There's the Werner Vinge series as well. That's just like 80,000 years plus. Like we're not even human anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you throw out those things and say we want to make a really alien world like Cud did, then it's contingent on you to build, some structure for which your Mad Libs can acquire meaning. Maybe that's just very carefully structured Mad Libs. A lot of people can do that. Dwarf Fortress does that, right? Like that's, each world is unique. But again, you've got some static bones in the commonalities between worlds, right? Like you're not dwarves one time and like space lizards the next, though you could imagine a system that's like that, right? And so if you sort of superimpose all the possible outputs, you end up with static bones anyway. Maybe you weren't mindful of those, but nonetheless, you're going to have these sort of common elements which players use to orient themselves, and those are going to imbue meaning and the variance and the variant output that you get. And so the question is really like, are you handcrafting them? Are you crafting the overlap between all of your outputs? Are you not thinking about it and having that happen implicitly, right?
A renamed trope is still a trope.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the extreme aversion and avoidance of all things trope I would say a little bit with the students, but in indie
I
spaces, the oh god, I don't want to have my elves look just like every other elf. I get it, and I do understand it, but I do think it's impossible to avoid all tropes ever because it is kind of
I
the
mean, tropes are tropes
antithetical.
because yeah, tropes are trope because people enjoy them,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
these are things that have resonated enough to appear more than once.
yep,
And so, to the extent you skew those tropes, it should be mindful, right? Like
sure,
Caves of Cut skews fantasy tropes, right? We don't have dwarves and elves and giants, but there's a big cost to that, which is that the players are immediately dissociated from a familiar framework which players can use to understand your game. If you encounter a dwarf, it's probably less dangerous than a dragon, right? If you encounter a salt hopper, is that more or less dangerous than an agglefly?
sure,
Right? Like
yeah,
there's no framework. You have to establish a whole new framework, and that's a big investment from a player. Um, and so, if you have something to say which doesn't care about that framework, right, which can use an existing framework, boy, you get a lot from using a Tolkien framework compare
yeah.
or London or Mars, if what you're trying to say isn't about that framework. So, be very careful because it's a big investment for you to create that framework. You're asking a lot from
Yep.
players to understand a new framework.
I think we had this discussion
Yeah,
at
we
the
probably did.
last physical GDC, but in making a sci-fi version of Merchant, I ran into the same problems. Is the clear understanding of like what's better than an iron sword? I don't know, a silver sword. What's better than silver sword? Gold sword. And people, you'll get the handful of people be like, well, actually, gold is bad for. But for the most part, it's the understanding of like these are the tropes that we move through. And so
Mhm.
moving to sci-fi, the question of like, do we tackle this in the kind of hard science fiction of is what is the better conductor? What is the better element of use for this? And a lot of questions that we had to deal with in the same respect is if we're going to use hard science fiction, we have to fully commit to it. But if we bend even a couple rules, then we might as well go full in. But
Mhm.
even with that, every sci fi creator has chosen their own path down that route. So there isn't a one well understood iron to silver to gold sword for sci-fi, right? If I say a
Yep.
tachyon missile versus a gamma ray, you can't tell me which of those are better, even though you've probably heard those used in a dozen different sci-fi tropes and spaces. So,
Yep.
yeah. Yep.
Agreed.
Okay, so I have a couple more questions from the students. So I want to talk a little bit back into the world of development here. So you said at one point many moons ago on, I believe it was a Reddit post, that CUD was originally a raw C# console app using Net 2.0,
Yep.
and it's made its way to Unity. And then Sproggywood was also in Unity. So I want to talk briefly about the process of going from no engine to engine. What do you miss about just kind of raw code? What do you absolutely adore about using something like Unity? Kind of the process of moving to that space.
Yeah, I'll give you a link. I did a talk called like the data driven engines of Caves of Cud for students interested in sort of like the deep history, the deep lore around. Um, and so you can look that up. Should I drop that into speaker questions here? Maybe here we go. So this talk gives some deep history. I'd been making roguelike engines since the early 90s, and those were our C++ engines at first. Um, and those failed for a variety of reasons. Making a roguelike, especially one with like as many varied interactions as you expect from a roguelike, is very hard. And you have problems like setting up class hierarchies, etc. And so there have been a couple talks, and this was actually when Unity got started in the early 2000s by Scott Billis around Dungeon Sieger's engine. And that was one of the very first entity component systems. And that I was interested in that. I had sort of like played around with a couple toy C++ entity component engines. And then one day we were training at work .NET 2.0. It had just come out, right? And I need some concrete project to learn stuff. And so we were interested in learning .NET 2.0, and I had to figure out, how am I going to make myself interested enough to learn this topic? And so I said, well, can I pop open a raw console in C#, right? Is it capable of that? Okay, cool. What if I tried to build one of these ECS toy engines for a roguelike? And I began that way, just to learn .NET 2.0 when it came out. And this is the same time Unity happens. And if you look at Unity's game object system and CUD's internal ECS system, they're very, very, very similar. Because when you sit down with .NET 2.0 and say, what does an ECS system look like in the naive world of the early 2000s, that's sort of what it looks like, is what Caves of CUD and Unity's game object-based ECS system look like. And so I built that out, and I had a basic fantasy engine going in C# after a year or two of just tinkering and it working pretty well. And Jason and I had been working on a fantasy world in a couple incarnations, like a tabletop role playing game and sort of a web game. And we said, well, what if we combined this freehold setting that we've been working on and like something that's a little more roguelike? Let's pick a corner of the world that's more roguelike-y, and throw in some Gamma World and throw in some of our interest in history and throw in some rifts, right? Like take these things that we think are interesting and don't exist in roguelikes and build this game out in C#. And we did. We launched the game in 2010 then, as a C# engine, which was just raw console engine. Later, I said, well, what if I did a OpenGL renderer for systems that don't have nice consoles nowadays, because the systems are getting away from consoles working. And so it had just a raw OpenGL engine. But when you start writing from engines from scratch in C# in 2008, 2009, 2010, you start going, well, I got to render fonts and I got to, figure out sound libraries, and this only works on Windows. And so that was sort of the state in 2012 or so. We had the Caves of CUD had been out for 2 years. It was a raw C# engine, Windows only. It had an OpenGL renderer. And we said, well, we have some commercial aspirations and we're starting to get old, right? Like we're in our early 30s. And if we're really serious about making games, we should try to win a game making contest. Because if we can't just like drop in and win a contest, we're no good, right? Like we're wise enough to know that maybe we are not good at making games, but let's test our mettle. And so we like entered Something Awful game jam, and we found an artist to work with, Jason and I. We found an artist, Yana, and we made a game called Madball for the SA Game Dev in Unity. I said, well, let me try Unity. It's C#. It's interesting, right? Like this was 2012, and it had started, Unity came out a couple years before. It was clear that Unity was sort of starting to lead the pack. It was in .NET, which I was now very familiar with from professional work and working on Caves of CUD. So that matches my aspirations well. Let's see how it works making Madball. And Madball succeeded. We won the contest. And I said, my experience with Unity was pretty good. That was kind of neat. I liked that. It did sound, it did font rendering, right? Like, it didn't have 2D framework at that point. It didn't have a UI framework. I like wrote the whole UI framework myself, or the sprite framework myself, right?
No nested prefabs.
Yeah, none of that. But it was C#. I understood the game object system because it was so similar to Caves of CUD systems. I said, oh, look, these guys are using the same original source material as I did for CUD. I get this. And so Yana, Jason, and I said, let's try to make a commercial game. And so we built Sproggywood using pieces of Caves of CUD. I had pathfinding, right? I had, some elements that were useful in making roguelike, simple level generation. And we pulled that into Sproggywood, and we shipped Sproggywood on Windows, Linux, OS X, iOS, and Android. I'd never shipped a commercial iOS and Android port. And I was like, this is going to be a nightmare. This is going to end me. I'm going to be all done doing anything professional when I ship this. And instead, it just worked. Unity out of the box shipped to iOS and Android, Linux and OS X and Windows. With some, there are trivial headaches you run into, but ultimately, I was able to support it all myself without any real big technical issues. And I was really impressed with that. I was very impressed with Unity's ability to go cross-platform. And so in the lee of Sproggywood's success, we asked Steam, hey, we've got this like weird indie game that 800 people play called Caves of CUD. We'd kind of like to launch this on Steam because there's there's one or two other traditional roguelikes that are succeeding. And so we said at that point it was like ASCII only in OpenGL, an emulated ASCII render. And I said, well, what if, given my knowledge now with 2 projects under my belt in Unity, I take the C# engine and lift it into Unity and use Unity for presentation and the transpilation to iOS and Android and Linux and OS X. That would be a big win. But it's really not obvious how I do this, because this is a console app. This is an app that's like waiting on Getch, right? And using console rights to a fake OpenGL console. And it's 500,000 lines of code doing that. So I'm not going to rewrite it, right? Like this is a substantial legacy product. And I'm the only technical person on the team at this point. And so what I did is I said, well, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to use Unity as presentation and input, and feed a shim that looks like the console and the keyboard, and run my whole game on a second thread. And have the game still think it's running as a console app. And is this even marginally possible? And it turns out it was. It worked. The Unity garbage collector at the time, when early mono was just awful, so I had to re-engineer a huge portion of the code base to like not generate any garbage using techniques like pooling. And you know, there was it was quite difficult to do performance profiling, because at the time Unity didn't support profiling of secondary threads, so almost everything I was doing was invisible to the profiler. So I had to write my own profile. That's not true. As of 2020, you can now see and profile multiple threads. Awesome. I think some of that in response to me complaining so much for 7 years about how multiple threads just didn't work. And so nowadays, Caves of Code is multi-threaded. It's multi-platform. We've got working builds for iOS and Android, though they haven't shipped yet. But it's not a technical problem. It's a user interface design problem for those platforms. Technically, it works fine. Unity is able to take that project, which was originally, a 2007 .NET 2.0 project, and transpile it to, Nintendo Switch if I wanted to, which is pretty wild. I mean, that's incredible power, especially in today's environment where if you're an indie game studio, making money is hard. It is hard. It is a tough financial business. And if you want to try to survive it all, you have to be on every platform you can get to, because each platform is a little accretive bonus. Each one couldn't make a living. Add 12 platforms together, maybe you can pay a salary, right? And a tool like Unity, compared to writing all of those cross-platform systems yourself from the ground up, is immensely valuable. You can take all of the power of Unity and or other big engines, take it off the shelf, take every other component, every other art asset you can off the shelf, and it's still almost impossible to ship a game, right? Like even taking 99% of your game off the shelf and using it, it is nearly impossible to succeed. So, Unity's done a lot for us. It's done very well for us.
Awesome. And thanks, Max, for the question regarding Unity. So we get a couple more. I want to ask you a couple about modding,
Okay.
about making Caves of Code moddable, and then we're just gonna kind of wrap up some questions from the students. So the first question for me is, can you tell us a little bit about the process of making Caves of Code moddable, actually getting it to where they can mod it? And then my follow-ups are going to be kind of specific on how to do that with Unity.
Yeah, so a couple stages here. Early on, Caves of Code was written as sort of a generic roguelike engine. That early 2007 was, I'm going to write an engine that I can build whatever roguelike in. And ECS is very amenable to pluggable systems. It was originally, like for Dungeon Siege, built so that they could plug Lua components in and have it work. And so it very nicely splits the technical engine and the sort of game design components, right? And I think a good game architecture does that implicitly, because unless you're a single person, and even if you are a single person, you're going to be flipping roles. You've got technical engine builders and you've got people who need to make a game. These are really distinct things, right? I want to make a potion of healing and I need to build the gears that make that engine work. What you really want to be able to do is build a framework and interface for these designers to be able to talk about their potion of healing only, and not have to worry about the underlying gears, to be able to say, this is the name and this is the color and this is the sprite and here's the little piece of Lua script that does the healing.
On
right?
active, do this. Yep.
Yeah, and so even if you don't have people doing it, right, as an engine designer, you're going to be changing roles where you're like, I'm building the engine and now I'm going to make a potion of healing. And you really don't want the cognitive load of this whole engine world when you're designing health potions. You want to be able to turn that off, put that away, and now you got the engine and you're thinking only about the world of your health potion, right? And you want that interface to be as lean as possible. And so I think if you do good engine architecture where you split the underlying gears, and you can look at engines like Unity that do a very good job of splitting the underlying gears and then allowing you to use game objects to describe your game logic, which in the enterprise world is like business logic. This is something the enterprise world has known for a long time, right? Like you've got model view controller patterns, which are all about having an individual model, having controllers that deal with that bare metal iron or bare iron engine stuff, bare metal engine stuff. And so like if you do that well, suddenly you've got a system that's amenable to modding, that you've got a world where people can define a component, a game object or something, writing just game logic code. And then the question is how it's really a technical one. Well, my designers can build a health potion with some data entry. And that YouTube video that I posted talks a lot about how this is possible. With some data entry, create a health potion with some components that they've defined. How can I allow a player now to inject their code into our system, their data into our system? And so it's mostly a matter of creating a loader that would load their data and merge it with ours, and then allow them to inject their code. There's a few ways to accomplish that. One is to provide whatever source code they need to compile a DLL and load it. In Caves of Cud, originally we only allowed sort of data modification. They could update our data files. We had a way to say, hey, you can patch our XML. Later, we added a .NET compiler, so at live time, we'll load your C#, we'll compile it into assembly when the game starts up, and then we'll just load the classes out of that assembly. So you can just include Roslyn in a .NET project and compile C#. It requires a little bit of work, but it's not too tricky. There's Unity packages out there that will do most of the work for you. Nowadays, though, especially for .NET projects, there's some really interesting tools. Our most recent big patch, Tomb of the Eaters, included a tool called Harmony in Caves of Cud itself. And what Harmony is a IL transpiler and modification tool, so that people can write a piece of code which will allows them to say, hey, at the start of this function in the .NET IL, inject this code, or inject this code at the end, or completely rewrite this IL function and replace it with this IL function. And Harmony, if you go look, is an open source project. So Caves of Cud at compile time will say, hey, any mods supporting Harmony? If so, I'll apply all your Harmony patches to my own code. So Caves of Cud self-patches on startup with the Harmony patches that the modders have supplied. And the modders could, in principle, just replace the whole game. And so it becomes a very powerful framework for modding game systems that you haven't necessarily invested the time to build interfaces for modders into. So it's sort of a safety hatch for modders to get into systems that you haven't provided the mod loading interfaces for.
I've seen a few games out there that actually will use Unity and its packages as the mod editing system, where the tool to mod the game is in fact Unity, and you're importing models, you're doing everything in Unity, you're just exporting a package, and then the game parses it. Have you experimented with that? Kind of consider that as a route?
I have not. I'm not super familiar with Unity packages, and I don't. Caves of Cud was sort of C# first, and so instead of Unity first, and so the actual Unity side project is mostly nothing, right? It's a presentation layer, and so most of its code exists outside of the Unity world. It would make more sense in a game that was more Unity first.
Sure, that makes sense. So the next question for me regarding the modding is, how active are you all as a dev team when it comes to helping modders answer questions, solve bugs? Is there a direct communication there, or is it kind of?
Yeah, extremely, and we've brought on some part-time people, like Narf in our community, that are direct liaisons with the modding community, that were modders themselves and are now paid to help build modding support into the engine and liaise with modders and meet their needs. So we're sort of directly out there collecting requirements from modders and building it into the game, because it's just hugely valuable to have a community.
That includes documentation as well. I've seen that there is the kind of modding wiki starting point.
I created a technical modding wiki, which was pretty weak, and the modders have created a live wiki on Gamepedia, which is much better than my documentation.
Always.
So the modding, the modding community has sort of done the work that I should be doing for me, in their own self-interest.
Okay, so I got 3 more questions from the audience, and then we're gonna wrap up on just kind of a little fun stuff where we talk about games we like.
Sure.
So the first one is, how do you think the pandemic has changed how people play games? And what do you think developers can do to adapt to those changes?
I think people are playing games more. I think players are looking for community more. Look at the success of Among Us. I think that's the biggest the biggest canary in the coal mine with respect to how people are playing games. I think that people are looking to replace some of the sense of community that they've lost. And I think to the extent you can support social community, you'll be more successful in the context of the pandemic. I think video games might see a drop in popularity after restrictions lift in a year or two as
Yeah.
people just get on it into the woods and into city streets and
Pokemon Go is
right.
going to get a second
Yeah,
resurgence. Yeah.
like a year or 2 or 3 of people playing board games, right? Like,
Yeah.
I might be working on if I was, like, really commercially minded, I might be working on physical space games that people are gonna play in 2022 when they burst out of their homes after being cooped up for 2 years.
Games that involve beards
Yeah,
for all the
exactly.
beards that have grown.
That's right.
Yeah. So the next question, and this one came earlier when we were talking about ProcGen in terms of all things considered. Is ProcGen harder to implement as environment fidelity increases?
I mean, higher fidelity is more expensive whether you're doing proc gen or handcrafted stuff. So I don't know that it's more expensive than it is, than the comparison between handcrafted and proc gen low fidelity stuff, right? It's just that high fidelity stuff is expensive. Your
Yeah.
input materials are expensive to make. It takes a lot more work. It takes, more technical framework.
I think something to consider with this question as well is that generally ProcGen systems are in the high fidelity stuff. I mean, you have 3D scanning of actual objects, you have
Yeah.
things like speed tree that are generating. So like there are ProcGen systems in there and developing those structures. Because hand texturing a rock to be as super realistic is not going to
Oh,
be
sure.
as
Yeah, so
fun and
so
easy.
it's a good point, right? Like it's true that a lot of those big AAA worlds are generated procedurally, but are single instances. You use a train generation system to generate the world of Skyrim, and then you sort of hand sculpt the results. But again, those are the sort of to loop back to sort of what I was saying originally. That's a lot of empowering artists by giving them AI muses that help multiply their capability,
Yeah.
right? Instead of hand painting a rock, I can curate a rock, right, and get the same result in less effort.
So I got one last question, which is kind of related to the production side of things. So when Caves of Cud started, it was yourself, Jason, and the artist, right? From
Yep.
Swargy Wood? Okay.
Yeah. Well,
And
when
now
Caves of Cud started, it was just me and Jason.
just you and Jason. So now
Yeah,
your team size is
it's still me and Jason. I mean, Jason's the only real full time employee still. We have many part-time contributors. We've got like a tile artist and a musician, who does the amazing music, and we've got two code contributors, one of which is the mod liaison. We have community managers, several of them that work our Discord. And some of those are daily, ongoing contributors. Some of them are orbit more distantly, but the team's quite large, right? I mean, it's like somewhere between 12 and 24 people in its most distant kind of composition.
how has that affected you and Jason specifically, like IC work? You're actually getting into the game versus being producers and being managers and
Yeah, I
handling
mean,
payroll.
yeah, I mean, nowadays it's sort of like Jason team includes Kalen, who runs Gra, right? So that the writing team is two people now, which it means that Jason spends some amount of his time working with Kalen on production, and same thing on the tech side. I spend some time running the project. Ultimately, though, we run a pretty complete set of management tools. We use Pivotal Tracker to do agile tracking, and we run a pretty standard agile project. Both me and Jason came from enterprise software. He worked at Salesforce for many years, and Ultimate Software. I worked at many big tech companies, including Dell. And so we have a lot of experience running relatively large projects. I've worked in project management on teams as big as 100, and so running a 6-person development effort is within our capabilities, but it does take some time, right? Like we spend a good amount of time running that project. It is something we're maybe more comfortable with than many indie teams.
Yeah. there's that generally assumed crunchy spot at about 8 to 10 people, where after that suddenly you start needing to consider a full-time producer or, full-time management. And so with everyone being part-time, you're probably not there, but maybe getting close to that edge of who's managing the manager's sort of environment.
Yep. Yeah, and we get a lot of effort. We get a lot of mileage out of a public bug tracker, for instance. So we meet like once a week as a big team to triage the bugs. But that meeting and the fact that the public can put in games, and we've got that wired up to our Discord so that our community managers can tag good bugs that our players are recording in the bug channel of the Discord, means that a lot, we've automated a little bit of the work that a product manager typically needs to do, and we try to do that where we can. Just because we don't have a lot of full-time hands-on, right? I mean, we need to
Totally
spread it
makes
out as
sense.
best as we can.
Awesome. So I think that does it for the questions from audience. There was a couple more I think I may have missed in the chat, but Brian, thank you for joining us.
Sure.
My kind of closing remarks, just to keep it a little nice on the brevity and fun side, is what games are you playing? Like, what are you into right now that isn't CUD? What's your
Yeah,
go-to?
I mostly play like big AAA games
You're a
and
big
like
Destiny player,
narrative
aren't
games.
you?
Yeah, I play Destiny a lot. I play Apex a lot. I play Apex with my kids nightly most of the time. I'm like an old school multiplayer FPS player, back to playing Doom 2 on bulletin board systems where you sort of dialed in over your phone, right, to play multiplayer FPSs. I also like big RPGs, so I'm looking forward to like Baldur's Gate 3 and next Elder Scrolls and their sci-fi game that's coming out, and Cyberpunk, right? I put a million hours into all the Elder Scrolls games and Witcher's 3 and Mass Effect and those kind of games. I also like Disco Elysium was so good, Obra Dinn was so good, but the games that really like those like really 5-star little narrative experiences are very rare, but I do enjoy them when they happen.
Awesome. I told you before we started, I jumped back into No Man's Sky after being away from it for quite a few months, and the new
Yeah,
update is pretty interesting. I still haven't found the giant sandworm though. I'm trying to, now that they announced Dune has been delayed, I'm
right.
determined. I want
That's
to be
your
more deep. I want to have the experience. I want to find the spice.
yeah.
So that's been my go-to the past week or so. Um, so yeah, Brian, thanks for joining us. I'm pretty sure the students appreciate this. We'll try to make this video live or available later for those who didn't catch it live. Probably that'll be an EGaDS thing, but probably through YouTube or something like that. Just so you all know, my next speaker that I'm going to be having joining us is Celia Pierce, who's with EGaDS, one of the founders of EGaDS, as well as she's done a bunch of awesome stuff. So I'm going to have her join us on the 10th. So that's actually kind of right around the corner. I'll post the link out to EGaDS and AET and all the different channels in UT, so you can submit questions to that one. I got a couple more speakers lined up in the next couple months, which is pretty exciting. This is the best we can do to make up for the lack of in-person FaceTime. So I hope you all enjoyed this. We're getting a lot of thank yous. I assume that's to Brian. Yeah,
Well,
Brian,
thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
yeah, for sure. And for those who didn't catch this earlier, check out the roguelike celebration from 2019 and from this year. It just wrapped up this weekend. A lot of great talks in there. They're all available on YouTube. I posted the link in the Twitch chat earlier, but you can always reach out to me if you can't find it later, as well as Brian's talk from, was it 2015? The
Yeah.
other talk that you suggested, that link is also available in the chat. So yeah, thanks y'all again. It was been great. Robert, you got the closing set up ready to go? I'm gonna assume so. So that'll wrap us up, and see y'all on the 10th.